listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
A car explodes outside the door of the Women's Hospital in Liverpool just seconds before the entire country falls silent to remember the fallen in Britain's wars. Some say it was just an eerie coincidence. I say to them, I've got a bridge here in London I could sell you. And on Remembrance Sunday, when the political hypocrites, their faces waxed with grief, bent double with the weight of their poppies, the people who sent so many of our young people to die and to kill. On that day, the departing General Sir Nick Carter, departing head of the British Army, declares we must prepare for war with Russia. The proximate cause is the refugee crisis in Poland, where the British armed forces are currently defending the frontiers of the European Union. But nobody is defending the frontiers of the United Kingdom, being breached daily. In one day last week, 1,200 people, young men, almost every one, none of which we knew anything about. It's the mother of all talk shows.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway.
This is Radio Sputnik.
First, Liverpool. Here's what we know, and then I'll tell you what I think. We know that at 10:59 a.m., just prior to the minute's silence observed throughout the land on Remembrance Sunday, a car exploded outside the door of the Women's Hospital in the great city of Liverpool. We know that one person is dead. We know that that person is the passenger who was sat in the back seat. We know that the taxi driver has survived because he was able to tumble out of his door before the car was engulfed in flames. We know that the counter-terrorism squad is leading the investigation. Here's what I think. I think that the passenger was a woman. I think the passenger fully intended going into the hospital. Somehow, the explosion happened before the passenger, whom I believe to be a woman, was able to go in there. I've been criticized on social media by journalists for not waiting for the police official statement. I bet those journalists don't get many scoops. I've got my own sources of information in Liverpool, and I believe that there's every reason to suspect this was a terrorist attack aimed at Britain on possibly the most sacred day, at the most sacred hour in our national life, when even the cynical, even those who oppose all wars, pause to remember those that fell. I do. Most of you in Britain almost certainly do also. We lament the fallen in the Second World War who died defending liberty, repelling fascism, saving the world from a fate almost unimaginable, in which every Jew in the world would have been annihilated, every gypsy, every gay person, every disabled person, every communist, every socialist, every Jehovah's Witness, anyone who would not succumb to the iron heel of Hitler fascism, Mussolini fascism, Tojo fascism would have been eliminated. And if our heroes, and above all the Russian heroes, and the other heroes from the other Soviet republics in the Red Army, which inflicted 79% of all casualties suffered by the Wehrmacht in the Second World War, the heroes that came from the United States of America in 1944 and landed on Omaha Beach in Normandy as the liberation of Western Europe began. If those heroes had not done so, I'd be speaking to you tonight in German, and my name would probably be Fritz or Erhard. But of course, I wouldn't be speaking to you at all, because under fascism, no such program as this Open University of the Airwaves could possibly have been tolerated. I'd be speaking to you, if I was at all even alive, to a script dictated by fascist Gauleiters who'd be sitting behind the glass now, ready to shoot me if I departed from the script. That's how big the stakes were. And anyone who does not respect those that gave their lives fighting fascism in the Second World War, in my opinion, deserves unalloyed contempt. We remember also those that fell in wars into which they were fooled, into which they were tricked by their rulers, wars which were unnecessary, wars which were ignoble. But that's hardly the fault of Tommy Atkins, who was conscripted and sent to fight in them. And so this day and that hour of 11 a.m. is sacred indeed. And if my speculation is right, that some terrorists sought to desecrate it with mass murder, then the plot thickens. We have, let me tell you, there's breaking news. We're now hearing that 3 men have been arrested under the Terrorism Act after one person was killed in a car explosion outside the Liverpool Women's Hospital. So, hey, Mr. Journalist, my sources were better than yours. I was right, and once again, you were wrong. The point, though, isn't it, that Britain is embroiled in a war against Islamist, fanatic, extremist terrorism. ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the alphabet soup of similar organizations are active and intend to harm as many of us. Even women in the women's hospital, a maternity hospital, are ready to harm, maim, murder any of us that they can to serve their evil purpose. Now, I use that as a segue into the next painful part of my monologue. I've been assailed by Trotskyites and liberals and anarchists and no doubt supporters of the most blue-blooded free market capitalism, all of whom have one thing at least in common: they don't believe in borders. They believe that the solution to the problem of Afghanistan is for Afghanistan to move here. The problem of Kurdistan to be solved by Kurdistan moving here. We have an existential threat in the landing of thousands of people every single week about whom none of us know anything at all, except this: the vast majority of them are men. The vast majority of those men are young men of fighting age, and they are arriving in rubber dinghies facilitated by the government of France, by the security forces of France, who turn a Nelson's eye, if they'll forgive me, to the fact that thousands of people are illegally leaving their country every week and landing equally illegally on our territory. Now, the liberals and the Trotskyites want to hang up banners saying refugees welcome. Well, not me. Because whilst every country, and ours more than almost any other, have a legal and moral responsibility to accept the refugees who are fleeing from genuine war and destruction caused by us, that's not a blank check for anyone and everyone to arrive and then disperse into the local population here because we are at war with terrorism right now, in plain sight. Mass murder was just narrowly averted, presumably, by a premature explosion in Liverpool today. Umpteen acts of mass murder have been planned and some executed in Britain over these last years. Of course, nobody needs to tell me what Britain did to help fuel this extremism, this fanaticism. I'm the last person you need to lecture about that for reasons which anyone who knows me already knows. But it's my duty now, as a political figure in Britain, to defend our island and our people from nihilistic terrorist acts which seek to punish innocent people for the crimes of guilty people. A crime in any jurisdiction, a sin in any religion. But the political class appear to think that by pulling the duvet over their heads and not talking about this, that somehow the problem will go away. Worse than that, Britain has sent armed forces to Poland to repel a group of refugees on the Belarusian border, smaller in number than the number that landed in one day in Britain from France last week. Imagine. We're defending the EU's border in Poland, but can't defend our own border in the United Kingdom from illegal people trafficking from the EU, from France. You couldn't make it up. But Boris Johnson has nothing to say about it. The Home Secretary, Priti Patel, sometimes says something about it, but never does anything about it. They blame the French. Just as well Mr. Churchill didn't do that in 1940. He could have blamed the French and all the other European armies that folded like cheap deck chairs in a matter of hours in the teeth of the Wehrmacht's advance. But he had no time to blame France. It was his job to defend Britain. But nobody is defending Britain now. And if anything, the posture of the Trotskyites and liberals and free market capitalists in the so-called Labour Party is even worse on the matter than that of Her Majesty's government. Which allows me to segue to General Sir Nick Carter. Assailed as we are by Islamist fanatic terrorism. He chose Remembrance Sunday to pronounce that Britain must get ready for war with Russia. Russia, almost as if he didn't know that any war with Russia would leave the entire island of Great Britain a smoking, radioactive pile of ash, and every person living in it would be dead. That's what General Sir Nick Carter says that we have to get ready for. Now, maybe he doesn't mean it, but the Russians have no reason to trust that. After all, it's exactly 100 years ago since we last invaded Russia. Hundreds of thousands of our soldiers invaded Russia 100 years ago only. There are people alive today in Russia that were alive when we last invaded them. So now we have the Russian people being told on this day of all days that we've got to get ready for war with our former ally, without whom we'd all be speaking in German. It is simply intolerable that these masters of war, these dogs of war, can ceaselessly bark and threaten countries like Russia, like China, who are exponentially more powerful than them. Maybe they're threatening Russia with America's army, just like Mussolini used to threaten people with Hitler's army. This is intolerable. If we tolerate it, we may very well find that we are on a slippery slope to war, the last war, the war to end all wars, because there'll be nobody left alive to fight the next one. The aforementioned Boris Johnson has now slipped behind Keir Starmer in the public opinion polls. You wouldn't believe that that was possible. It's like somebody telling you that Laurel and Hardy have streaked ahead of you in a foot race. It is almost impossible to believe that this block of wood, so wooden the birds are nesting in him, is now, in one case, 6 points ahead of a Tory government with an 80-seat majority. Whilst Boris Johnson, unlike David Cameron, who only hugged a husky, has actually zipped himself in to a polar bear suit, gone green, gone gaga, threatening us all with environmental perdition unless we pony up thousands of pounds, scrap our boilers, scrap our cars, go cold, shower cold, eat cold dinners. He's lost control of the borders. He doesn't want you to notice. So he wants to terrify you with environmental perdition instead. All the talk at Westminster is that Boris Johnson is not much longer for this political world. We have a poll running now about who will be the next Conservative leader. And finally, in the moment or so left to me, Her Majesty the Queen was missing today on Remembrance Sunday, which she has religiously attended throughout her long reign. There is speculation that this 94-year-old lady is more seriously ill than the media are telling us, than the political class are telling us. I put my cards on the table. I wish her even longer life than she has enjoyed. I wish her no harm at all. I respect the efforts that she has made as the longest serving British head of state. It would be unbecoming not to. An old lady who recently lost her husband. But I will not myself accept Prince Charles as the head of state of this country upon her demise, which I say, I hope is long in the future. I think that Prince Charles would be a disaster for British democracy and for British public life in general, for reasons I'm more than happy to adumbrate. In my view, if the monarchy had any sense, Charles would abdicate the moment that he became king and pass it on to his elder son, Prince William. But I am determined, upon the passing of Her Majesty the Queen, to campaign for a grown-up republic in Britain, because I believe it is demeaning to a country like ours in the almost end of the first quarter of the 21st century to be ruled by the rules of primogeniture, where you have no say, and where, if you're unlucky, you might get a gibbering idiot as your head of state. That's my monologue. The rest is up to you. This is the mother of all talk shows.
Radio Sputnik.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones, with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
All talk shows. Join our faculty of legends, contributors, and callers. Everyone is welcome.
Now, one of many things that I have in common with my next guest is a fascination, an endless one in my case, for the Cambridge spy ring. The most famous, of course, being Kim Philby, the one-time almost head of the British security services, who had in fact been a Soviet agent since the early 1930s. Guy Burgess, his colourful, to say the least, sidekick, and of course Donald Maclean, who was tipped to become the United Kingdom's ambassador in Washington. But in 1979, a fourth man was outed by Mrs. Thatcher. And by coincidence, I was in the House of Commons that day in 1979 when Mrs. Thatcher told the country what the state had known for very much longer. That Anthony Blunt, the keeper of the Queen's pictures, working at the Courtaulds Institute and in Buckingham Palace, had been, since the early 1930s, an agent of the Soviet intelligence service, the NKVD, later the KGB. The fifth man we might talk about. In fact, there's probably a sixth, there might be a seventh, and I have a sneaking suspicion there's at least an eighth. Now, Andrew Lownie, who spoke so peerlessly when he was last on the show about Lord Mountbatten, my interview with him proved one of the most successful clips we've ever had, is the author of Stalin's Englishman, the story of the aforementioned Guy Burgess. So on this anniversary, I could think of nobody better to speak to, and I'm glad to say Andrew agreed. Andrew, thank you very much indeed for joining us. If you wouldn't mind starting with Blunt, as it's his anniversary, why did the state wait so long to out him? Why didn't they out him when they found him? Or alternatively, why out him at all?
Well, it's very good to be back with you. The line from Harold Macmillan was, when my gamekeeper finds a fox, dead fox, he doesn't bring it into the house, he buries it in the garden. And that was the approach that they took to all the Cambridge spies. The fact is that none of the five actually, in a sense, paid for their crimes. They were either given immunity or allowed to escape. The only one who was actually sent to prison was George Blake, and that was because he didn't go to the right school. So this is their default position. Far better to sort of sweep the thing under the carpet. It was highly embarrassing in terms of their relations with the Americans, and frankly, a public relations disaster. They'd already let Klaus Fuchs, in a sense, get away. So there are a whole series of things going on, and the British, frankly, didn't want this thing to become a public scandal. It was fine for the Russians and the British Secret Service to know about it, but they didn't want the British public to know about it.
Why then did Mrs. Thatcher make the statement she did all those years ago, but all those years later, after they had outed him?
Wasn't an establishment figure. I think she was appalled when she discovered that he had been given immunity in 1963. But also her hand was forced. The fact is that various people had begun to talk to a man who was writing a book called The Climate of Treason. There was stuff appearing in Private Eye. Blunt, though he hadn't been named, had been, in fact, knew that he had been rumbled and was beginning to take legal action or threatening legal action. So the story basically was out. She had no choice but to do something. But I think she was appalled when she discovered what had been going on, because for her, these were traitors. And the situation goes on, as you say. I don't think there's an eighth man. I think there are about 20, 30 men. And I continue to make my attempts to uncover this, and again have problems with the government trying to shut it down. There's a vetting file for a man who I believe was part of the ring, who continued to work until the 1970s, which they're refusing to release. So this is a problem that's gone on for a long time. It continues to go on. There was a cover-up in 1951 when Burgess and Maclean fled to the Soviet Union, and nothing has changed in the intervening 70 years.
Now, Blunt was a very important figure in the early days of the Cambridge Ring. He had a certain seniority and gravitas, and his particular favourite was the man that you wrote so magnificently about, Guy Burgess. Tell us about that relationship, if you will.
Well, the first to be recruited was Kim Philby, who was sent back to basically recruit his chums from Cambridge. The Russians had decided that they would have this sort of deep penetration mole approach, where they would pick bright young undergraduates from the best universities. They would go into deep cover into the civil service or the Foreign Office or MI5 and MI6 and journalism. And then they would be activated many years later. And Philby did that. He went back and he produced a list of 5 with Donald Maclean at the top and Guy Burgess at the bottom. Now, we don't know who the other names were, so numbers 2, 3, and 4 may have refused, or they may have been recruited and we don't know about them. And they were slightly nervous about Burgess, but Maclean accepted immediately. This was in 1935. Burgess was very indiscreet, and that's not normally a characteristic of spies. But he sort of got to hear about it, and he thought it was rather exciting, and they had to basically let him in. And one of the pluses for him was that he was gay at a time when, of course, it was illegal. He had to lead his life covertly, and that, of course, is a perfect cover for a spy. So Burgess was recruited. I think many others were recruited because the Russians numbered their recruits, and there are huge gaps between the ones that we know were recruited and when they were recruited and other figures. I think there were people like Leo Long, and Michael Straight, and Alistair Watson, who were also recruited at this time. Now, Blunt was recruited because he was the lover of Burgess. Maclean had also been the lover of Burgess, so there was a sort of there was a sexual element to this as well. And Blunt, of course, as you say, became very important because he had close links to the royal family. He was much older than them. And he was able to get into MI5 at the beginning of the war. Burgess had got Philby into MI6, where he, in fact, had been working since the mid-30s. So he is a much more important figure than I think we realized, because he got these people into the intelligence services, and he was the first to be working for the intelligence services himself. It says something about how poor the records were, that Blunt on one day received a letter saying, "You're a communist and we don't want you," by MI5, and also on the same day saying, "You speak German and we'd love to have you." So he ignored one letter and just
acted on the other, yeah. Well, he was an educated man. He did the obvious thing in those circumstances. Talking of educated men, what was it that motivated these highly educated, some cases quite brilliant men? Blunt was a very brilliant man in his field. Even Burgess had moments of brilliance. What was it that drew them together and made them adhere to the Soviet cause in the mid-1930s?
Well, you're right. They were all brilliant. They all had first-class degrees. They were all clearly going to the top, which is why they were approached. They all knew each other, which is why we talk about the Cambridge spy ring. They were all direct contemporaries at Cambridge within a few colleges. And they were recruited for a mixture of reasons, or joined the Soviet Union. They were looking for some sort of purpose in their life. So there was a very strong personal element to it. There was a certain sense of épater la bourgeoisie, getting back at the establishment. They'd failed, the old generation had failed them. They'd seen the problems, economic problems, and the need for national government in the early 1930s. They felt politically that the only people standing up to the fascists were the communists, and they were a bulwark against them. And they were recruited in a very sophisticated way by the Russians, who used Central Europeans who were multilingual, who often were highly educated, and they seemed very attractive father figures. And I think many of the Cambridge spies had lost their fathers. Burgess at the age of 13, Maclean, again, I think at university. Blunt, Philby's father had been absent, and Blunt's father died again when he was quite young. So these people, in a sense, became figures of authority and direction to these slightly aimless people who felt, like Burgess, that perhaps his talents hadn't been recognized and that they could make some sort of impact on the world. Burgess, when he left Cambridge, though he had this first-class degree, basically failed at a whole series of jobs. Failed to get into the Times, he failed to stay on at Cambridge and do a doctorate and become a Don. And so the Russians gave them, in some ways, an identity which they felt they lacked.
The three that ran away to Moscow lived quite quixotic lives. Philby later ending up with Maclean's wife. Burgess, I recall vividly an interview with Canadian television, which had laid buried for decades, describing himself in cut-glass English as a non-party Bolshevik. He remained loyal, it seems, to the ideology that he had joined. And Philby, of course, who lived the longest of the three, when asked by Philip Knightley, one of his biographers, if he had, did he have any regrets at losing his faith, he insisted that he had kept his faith, meaning his faith in the Soviet Union and in the ideology that prevailed there. That would not seem to suggest aimlessness, Andrew. It would seem to suggest fairly solid commitment.
Well, I mean, Philby, for example, was so unhappy in the Soviet Union, he tried to commit suicide, and they all turned to drink. There was nothing much else in the Soviet Union. So what they said in public didn't necessarily reflect what they felt in private. But you're right, there is a certain something to admire. They picked their team early on, and they stuck with it. And they never actually went back on that. Burgess, though he'd abandoned, his mother, his friends, the things that really counted, like the Reform Club, at a very early age. He was 50 when he went to Russia. He never had any regrets, though you get a very poignant picture in Alan Bennett's play An Englishman Abroad of him there. Maclean, I think, was the one who settled in most. His family were with him, and even though there was the betrayal of his wife leaving him for Philby, he, in some ways, had been the most politicized of them. Though he didn't believe in Stalinism, and of course they didn't come to Moscow until Stalin was dead, he actually believed in perestroika. He sort of adapted, and they all did. They were chameleons. They've adapted all their life, and they justified it themselves, because, of course, if they'd admitted to themselves that they got it wrong, they would have realized their lives were a complete waste.
Which begs the question then, did Blunt feel the same way whilst he was discussing with Her Majesty the Queen her pictures?
Well, there's that wonderful partner play, The Question of Attribution, by Alan Bennett, in which he and the Queen are having a conversation about truth and the pictures. And we all know, and that in fact they know too, that he's a spy. The Queen, I'm sure, was briefed very early on that he was a spy. He was suspected even from 1951. So even when he basically confessed in 1963, that was the end of a period of long suspicion. I think the feeling was that if he hadn't been given the job in the palace, it would have sent out a signal to the Russians that he had been blown. And I think one of the things the British felt is that they could sometimes play material back to the Russians if they didn't know that their agents had been caught. But yes, of course, there is this extraordinary irony about Blunt staying within the establishment. They were all complete hypocrites in terms of the way they operated. He, in some ways, was the one who managed to get out. He refused to flee in 1951, though he helped arrange the escape of Maclean and Burgess. He was able to go back to his career as an academic, and though he helped them in some ways, his role was most important during the war when he worked in MI5.
You made a remarkable allusion earlier to George Blake, who only died very recently, I think at the age of more or less 100, in Moscow. You made the point that he went to jail because he'd gone to the wrong school. And the corollary of that is that the others had all gone to the right schools and the right universities. That tells you something about the upper reaches of the British state, at least at that time. Maybe it's different now, where one of us, people like us, was the prevailing zeitgeist. So someone who went to the right school, was a member of the right club, would get into the upper reaches of the establishment without too much checking on who and what they really were.
Well, I think that's why the Cambridge spy ring fascinates us. It's about all sorts of things, sexual politics and class among them. And I think the Russians recognized very astutely that these people would never be suspected because of their backgrounds. And that was the great shock, to discover that you could go to Eton and be a spy. When there was the first suspicion of Burgess and Maclean, they didn't look at the diplomats, who were the people who were seeing the documents that were being revealed. They looked at the cleaners and the clerks, thinking it must be them. And there's still, I would say, that mindset that jolly good chaps don't behave like that, and the problems must lie elsewhere. So I think, sadly, the lessons still haven't been learned.
Well, finally, and I'm grateful for your time always, let me be devil's advocate for a minute. What exactly did they do wrong? They tried to bolster the fight against fascism. We became not just partners with the Soviet Union in the Second World War, but if not for the Soviet Union, the war would almost certainly have been lost and we wouldn't be having this conversation now. Their case would be that whatever they gave to the Soviet Union, the state, the government, should have given of its own volition.
Well, I mean, Burgess was recruited in the mid-1930s and worked to the 1951 intelligence. Philby was recruited during the beginning of the war and worked, frankly, until 1963 when he fled. So it's a long period when we were not allies with the Soviet Union, not least when they were the allies of the Nazi Germany. So, I mean, they made a lot of, sort on their head several times, a lot of somersaults to justify their position. The fact is that these were people at the top of the intelligence organizations, the Foreign Office. Everything that crossed their desk was sent to the Russians. The Russians actually knew our negotiating position, for example, in the four-power conference before the British negotiators knew. It wasn't just the intelligence information, which of course led to agents being killed. It was the way all the information about particular people, politicians, that could be used for blackmail. Burgess was in a sense, the special advisor to the Foreign Office Minister dealing with intelligence services at a crucial point at the end of the war when all the institutions...
Well, he was sleeping with them and working in Parliament.
Exactly. He had, and also, of course, he had this terrific role as an agent of influence because he got people onto the radio as a radio producer who could then, of course, spread the word. So he worked on a whole series of levels. It's not just about the secrets he betrayed. It's about the influence he was able to exert in the media and about, to say, these elements of blackmail. When he fled, they found all these love letters in a guitar case. And MI5 thought that was rather charming until they realized that these were letters that were used for blackmail purposes. And there is some suspicion that one of the senior Conservative ministers, who was later Chancellor, turned a blind eye to what was happening in terms of currency infringements because Burgess had something on this former Chancellor.
And I said it finally, but this is a postscript. And yet, people like you and me are still fascinated by them. And I get the feeling, I may be wrong, you may have a very different view, that people in Britain don't hate them.
Well, I think they seem romantic figures. I don't think people realise the damage they did. It's sometimes difficult to do an audit of treachery, to show the causation between particular events. But, you know, Burgess was a very charismatic figure. He was, a drunk for a large part of his life, but he was amusing, he was intelligent, he mixed with all sorts of people who took him seriously, like George Orwell and others. So there was a hinterland there. And I think we're all interested in the psychology of betrayal. And so they are fascinating figures as characters, and particularly good for a biographer. But also, they still have a relevance to the contemporary world. We still have our tensions with the Soviet Union. We still have cover-ups going on.
I've got news. I've got news for you, Andrew. The Soviet Union is 30 years dead.
Well, I think the intelligence services of Russia are no different to the intelligence services they work for.
I suppose ours are no different either to what they were back then. Now, your book, Stalin's Englishman, is an absolutely brilliant read. I commend it to everyone. Funnily enough, An Englishman Abroad, Bennett's story, was filmed in the city of Dundee when I still lived there. Indeed, I was the party boss there. And the city square was covered in snow. The Marx, Engels and Lenin were hung from the Caird Hall balustrade. The centre of Dundee was transformed into Red Square Moscow, just in case I wasn't already enthralled enough in this story. What's your next one, Andrew? Have you got something else coming out soon?
Well, I've only just published a book called Traitor King, The Scandalous Exile of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, which, based on deep archival research, I think pretty much makes the case completely that the Duke of Windsor was a Nazi agent during the war and that people were executed for far less than he did. It also looks at the emptiness of the Wallace and Duke of Windsor relationship, that this was not a great love affair, but two pathetic people who were trapped together.
I look forward to that very much indeed. Andrew Lownie, it's always a great pleasure to talk with you. Thanks for joining me on the mother of all talk shows. Now, I've got a break question. In this week in 1904, this will knock you out, this question. In this week in 1904, King C. Gillette patented the disposable razor. But what did his lifetime campaign hope to achieve? If you get this, I'm a Dutchman. A, socialism. B, black votes. C, conquering Mexico. Answer after the break.
Radio Sputnik.
The mother of all talk shows was created because early lunacy detection can save lives. At the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, some IQs declined by 90%. Now, doctors are diagnosing later stage lunacy, which could have been detected sooner. Don't wait. Share the mother of all talk shows with a loved one and speak to George Galloway about common sense today. It takes all of us to overcome idiots. Call the teacher today and get an education.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Well, I am greatly indebted to my erudite, wise editor, Ron Mackay, for this question about Gillette, the disposable razor man. For I had no earthly idea of this. But the answer is, Gillette spent a lifetime campaigning for socialism. He was a utopian socialist who believed everyone should live in a giant city called Metropolis, powered by the Niagara Falls. As I say, if you knew that, I'm a Dutchman. Now, here's the telephone numbers. If you're in the United Kingdom, it's 08081 965522, 08081 965522. It's entirely free, remember. And if you're in the United States, it's equally free, which you might find even more remarkable. But the number, if you're in the United States, or Canada actually, is +1 844 944 3344. And you can email the show anytime on air at moats.tv. You can also tweet, of course, as many people are doing. Now, we've got this poll running. Who will be the next leader of the Conservative Party? The answers so far: A, Rishi Sunak, the current Chancellor of the Exchequer. For overseas viewers and listeners, that means he's in charge of the money, he's the finance minister. B, Liz Truss, she's the Foreign Secretary. I know it's difficult to believe, but she is. And 29% favour her. And C, Michael Gove, 13%. Poor Michael. How is it on, that's on Twitter. On YouTube, Sunak, same as 57, Truss 18, quite a bit less, and Gove 25, quite a bit more. So wee Michael's got much more support on YouTube. If he's watching, switch to YouTube. Telegram, Sunak 62%, Truss 17%, and Gove 21%. So Telegram and YouTube favour Gove more than Twitter, which gives them only 13%. Now, you can, of course, vote on my Twitter feed. Have I got time for some social media? All right, I've got to get straight on. I mentioned at some length earlier that today is Remembrance Sunday. Geoff Tibbs is a peace activist for the Peace Pledge Union. Now, many of you may not have heard of the Peace Pledge Union, though I've been aware of them since my youth. Their principal badge is that they wear white poppies and market white poppies rather than red ones. And we thought it would be useful to get the perspective of people who are avowedly pacifist, against war, I think against all war, on this day. And so I'm grateful for Geoff's attendance this evening on Remembrance Sunday. Geoff Tibbs, thanks very much for joining us. I was with one of your colleagues just yesterday making another television program, so I'm seeing these white poppies quite regularly this weekend. Explain them first, if you would.
So thanks for having me on. So the white poppy has three meanings. The first is remembrance for all victims of war. That includes civilians who make up the vast majority of victims of war. It includes people of other nationalities. And that
including Nazi soldiers?
Well, it includes people of all nationalities, so it includes all victims of war. That's in a spirit of remembrance. It doesn't mean honoring them, it doesn't mean celebrating them. It's important to recognize the human cost of war. And as I say, our main focus is on those who are systematically excluded from the mainstream, which would include civilians, those who it suits the British government to forget, such as people dying of starvation currently in Yemen. The second meaning is challenging militarism. That includes the militarization of remembrance itself, which is often conducted with military paraphernalia and processions and so on, and in a way that lends support to the institution of the armed forces. And the third meaning is building a culture of peace. Now,
your campaign, it's just, you might say, a rose by any other name. It's a poppy, it's a white one rather than a red one. Tends to provoke a lot of controversy, sometimes even hate, certainly malice. Why is that, do you think?
I think it's often through misunderstanding, to be honest. I mean, a couple of years ago, there was an independent poll that we commissioned, which showed that the vast majority of people actually are in favor of remembering civilians on Remembrance Sunday. They're in favor of remembering people of all nationalities. And in fact, many people, when you speak to them, tend to feel that the red poppy encompasses such people. Whereas in fact, the official narrative, the official meaning of it is quite different. The official meaning of the red poppy is to focus exclusively on British and Allied military victims of war. And so that's what we want to change. That's what we want to broaden. And in fact, when you speak to people about it, I tend to find people are very supportive. So I think it's misunderstanding, really.
And is your campaign growing or retracting? As I say, I've known of you for well over 50 years. Is it getting bigger? Are you selling more white poppies or fewer?
More in general. I mean, a few years ago was the first time that more than 100,000 were sold, mainly around the UK, but also some other countries too. This year, for example, we've seen quite a sharp rise in the number of outlets around the country, shops, cafes, community centres, union branches and so on, selling white poppies. We've also seen more and more people using white poppies in ceremonies around the country. So yeah, there's growth. It's obviously up and down, and the pandemic hit the white poppy campaign as it did a lot of other things, but yeah.
And what do you do with the money that you raise?
So any profits raised from it, I mean, I should say, firstly, it's not primarily a fundraising tool, but any profits go towards the Peace Pledge Union's peace education work and campaigning against militarism and against war. It's primarily about the meaning, as I say, but we do, we're a not-for-profit organization, and any money is channeled back into our work to try to make the world a more peaceful place.
And are you against all war? Are you strictly, entirely pacifist? Would you have stood up to Hitler at the Channel ports, or would you have downed tools, as it were?
I mean, are you asking me personally or the Peace Pledge Union? I mean, well, we are against all war. We're against all militarism, whether that's militarism on the part of NATO, militarism on the part of Russia or the US or the UK. And to us, it's about opposing the causes of war as well as war itself when it arises. It's about opposing the system that leads to war, the military-industrial complex, the arms trade, the kind of ideology that lends support to war. That's what being a pacifist means to me.
You don't buy the Thomas Aquinas concept of the just war?
No, certainly not. I mean, I think war tends to result in cycles of violence. I mean, you can see that in Afghanistan today. You can see it around the world. It's something that, war as we tend to encounter it tends to be waged by powerful states that do the most damage, often against much weaker adversaries. And, in this country, there's a lot to question, an increasing military budget, a huge increase in the nuclear weapons cap that's recently been introduced by Boris Johnson's government, the largest increase in military spending since the Korean War. These are the kinds of things that are the pressing issues that we address.
Well, they're all very noble causes, but the concept of the just war justifies standing up to Hitlerism. And if we had not stood up to it, those who are not pacifists, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now, would we?
I mean, to me, I focus on remembrance. It's a question of whether we propagate a morally sanitized version of the past, whether we ignore certain chapters of the past in favor of teaching a kind of good versus evil narrative. I mean, when we talk about the white poppy, we try and shine a light on history and the horrors of war in its fullness. There's some things about the Second World War that are never talked about in this country, and I don't want to come on this program or any other and issue kind of nationalist sound bites about the Second World War, as we're often expected to at this time of year. So for me,
there's no nationalist soundbite from me, because I'm the last person that could reasonably be described as a nationalist. I do know that my grandfathers put a gun in their hand and a tin hat on their heads to stop fascism. They killed fascists, because if they had not, then Nazism, fascism, Hitlerism would have conquered this island, and we literally would not be having this conversation. Neither of us would likely be alive. There's no way around that moral point, is there?
I mean, I don't at all mean to cast judgment on the people you're talking about who went to fight fascism, nor do I want to cast judgment on people who, in a desperate situation, took up arms to combat colonialism. That's not the point of pacifism to me at all. I mean, I'm only just over 30 years old, and I can see the world in front of me has a whole load of problems associated with militarism. It's a system, as I say, that has as part of it, the arms trade, the actions of the British government overseas. It's something, I've grown up really under the shadow of the war on terror. This is the reality that the campaigning that we do addresses. It's not about historical hypotheticals for me. I mean,
there's nothing hypothetical about the Second World War, I can tell you, or about the events in Liverpool today. However, Geoff, you've played a good innings with a straight bat. Geoff Tibbs, peace activist for the Peace Pledge Union, thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. In the second half of the show, we have a fascinating discussion on China and Taiwan and the coolest cats, Garland Nixon, and for the very last time, our very own James Giles. So, stay tuned for the second hour of the mother of all talk shows.
Radio Sputnik News.
Counter-terrorism police officers are investigating an explosion in a taxi outside a London hospital which killed one person and injured another. According to eyewitnesses, the taxi burst into flames in front of Liverpool Women's Hospital just seconds before 11 a.m. this morning, when a minute's silence to commemorate the war's dead on Remembrance Sunday was taking place. A police spokeswoman said it has not been declared a terrorist incident, but counter-terrorism detectives were leading the inquiry out of caution. She added it could take some time before they confirm details. The president of COP26, Britain's Alok Sharma, says China and India will have to explain themselves to climate-vulnerable nations as the summit ends. It comes after the two nations pushed for the language on coal to change from phase out to phase down in the deal agreed in Glasgow. However, Sharma insisted the historic deal keeps 1.5 centigrade within reach. It is the first ever climate deal that plans explicitly to reduce coal, the worst fossil fuel for greenhouse gases. The summit, which was initially due to end on Friday, had to go into overtime before a deal was agreed late on Saturday, following the late intervention from India to water down the language on coal. Her Majesty the Queen has missed the Remembrance Sunday service at the Cenotaph in London, as according to Buckingham Palace, she has a sprain in her back. The palace said the 95-year-old monarch was disappointed not to attend the event. The palace previously said it was the Queen's firm intention to attend the service after taking away from her duties for health reasons. She made the decision to miss the event with great regret this morning, a statement has said. Cocaine with a street value of £33 million has been discovered in a lorry load of frozen onion rings bound for the UK. Border Force officials found the 418-kilogram haul at the Channel Tunnel's UK inbound zone in France. A 30-year-old Polish lorry driver has been charged with smuggling Class A drugs. He has appeared at Folkestone Magistrates Court and was remanded in custody until 13th of December. Japan's former Princess Mako has departed for the United States with her new commoner husband, Kaim Komuro, after leaving the Japanese royal family. There was a minimal pageantry as the college sweethearts, who wed last month, left from Tokyo Airport this morning. They will rent an apartment in New York, where Komuro works as a law firm. Under Japanese law, female imperial family members forfeit their status upon marriage to a commoner. The US military covered up an attack that killed dozens of civilians in Syria. That's according to an investigation by the New York Times. The 2019 attack on the so-called Islamic State fighters killed 80 people, only 16 identified as militants. An independent investigation into the strike was never conducted, according to the New York Times. Officials admitted the bombing for the first time this week, but insisted it had been justified. They say it was unclear if all of those killed, aside from the 16 militants, had been civilians. The FBI has launched an investigation after thousands of fake messages were sent from one of its servers warning of a possible cyber attack. The government agency said the incident on Saturday morning was part of an ongoing situation, but provided no further details. The messages purported to be from the US Department of Homeland Security. They claimed to be a warning about a supposed threat and were titled Urgent Threat Actor in Systems. The emails told recipients that they were the target of a sophisticated chain attack from an extortion group known as the Dark Overlord, according to the non-profit anti-spam watchdog Spamhaus. According to US media reports, more than 100,000 emails were sent out. At least 68 prisoners have been killed in new fighting at the Ecuadorian prison, where more than 100 inmates died in clashes between rivals. The riot at the Liliortal Penitentiary in the city of Guayaquil reportedly began on Friday evening. Police tactical units who entered the prison buildings found guns, explosives and blades. Officials say they have regained control of the jail. And finally, you may think it's barking, but man's best friend no longer has to put up with joining humans on the sofa for soaps or a binge-watch series. Tomorrow, the nation's dogs will have a range of specialist four-legged friendly content to enjoy. Dog TV is a new television network created specifically for lonely or stressed canines, which is set to launch in the UK on Monday. Created after 3 years of research, the channel will air scientifically tested programming aimed to alleviate symptoms of conditions such as separation anxiety, loneliness and stresses, bosses say. It will also have shows to help owners better understand and look after their pets. British animal trainer Victoria Stilwell said, "People think that dog TV is a bit of a weird concept at first, but when I tell them the amount of research that has gone into this, that this TV channel can help their dogs while home alone, improve their lives considerably and help with different stresses and anxieties, they get it." The service will be available on a range of smart TVs, Android and Apple devices, and also online. And that's your Sputnik News. I'm Elliot King.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Now, just an update. 3 people have been arrested by counter-terror police following a fatal car explosion outside a Liverpool hospital. The men are aged 29, 26 and 21, according to police, and were detained in the Kensington area of Liverpool before being arrested under the Terrorism Act in connection with the explosion outside the front door of the Women's Hospital in Liverpool. And I quote, "Detectives from Counter-Terrorism Police Northwest continue to keep an open mind about the cause of the explosion and are working closely with colleagues at Merseyside Police as the investigation continues at pace." Armed police were pictured outside a house in the city following the explosion. A later statement confirmed what I told you earlier, that the deceased was a passenger in the car, which was a taxi, and that the taxi driver was injured and remains in hospital in a stable condition. You don't need to be Sherlock Holmes to work out what the evil intention was and why 3 people have been arrested under the Terrorism Act. They have not yet been charged, so I can still speak about it with a certain circumspection. But I knew, candidly, as soon as I knew the time of the explosion, seconds before the commemoration of Remembrance Sunday, when the whole country goes silent, for an explosion to take place at that exact moment, you didn't need to be Sherlock Holmes to work out what was happening. Who will be the next leader of the Conservative Party? Sunak is way in front on Twitter. He's up on 59%, on YouTube 55%, on Telegram 62%. The others are also Rands, but of the others, Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, has at least a semi-respectable 29% on Twitter at least, but only 18 on YouTube and only 17 on Telegram. Just before my next guest, can I read a few social medias? On the poll, Schopenhauer says, after Boris the buffoon's antics, it will probably be a sensible, safe pair of hands backed by the 1922 committee. In other words, Sunak. Personally, he says, or she says, I think Truss would be a great move. And the Baker man says, personally, I think they need a total change. Get rid of the old sleazy guard. I'd go for Mark Harper. Who he? I can hear echoing across the country. Tories kill. The money has selected Sunak. Gove's private life is too much of a liability. Matron. And Gammon King, MBE, says an actual Conservative would be nice. And Chris Strange says it's got to be Liz. She's got a touch of Thatcher about her, and Tories like that in a woman. You mean the smack of firm governance? Gove has already shown he's untrustworthy, and Sunak is only popular because he splashed the cash during the pandemic. In April, when reality bites, he won't be that liked. Now, the proximate reason for the current crisis which, just like on the Russian front, could be a cause of war, is the issue of Taiwan. My next guest is a professor of history at New Mexico State University and is an expert on this subject. So I'll let him outline it before I pitch in with my own views. Dr. Hammond, thanks very much for joining us. Now, as I understand it, it is the position of the United States government that there's only one China, and ipso facto, Taiwan is a part of it. It is the position of the international community. Virtually every country in the world recognizes only one government in China. It was the position of the victorious powers at the end of the Second World War, one of which was nationalist China. Chiang Kai-shek, who later went on to found Taiwan, was one of the victorious allies. And there was never any question that Taiwan was not part of China. How come this question suddenly has arisen?
Well, I think the question has popped up now, not so much because of anything having to do with China itself, but because of the anti-China campaign that's being waged by a lot of American politicians. Exactly as you say, China has always been a single entity. China and Taiwan are one country. And indeed, the authorities in Beijing and the local authorities in Taipei all agree to that. There's some dispute about who is actually the legitimate government of the country, but both sides agree that there is only one China. The only people that are really trying to manipulate that at this point are a relatively small number of politically ambitious figures on the island and politically ambitious figures here in the United States. It's very easy for American politicians to stir up trouble around China and try to make themselves look tough and look assertive. But the real issue is not a difference between China, mainland China, and the island of Taiwan. Taiwan is part of China, always has been, and both sides of the straits recognize that.
This is not a red-blue, a Democrat-Republican issue. The One China policy was written by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. It started going nuclear, if you'll forgive the phrase, under Donald Trump, but it's being continued gung-ho by Joe Biden.
Well, I think we started to have this problem even before Trump. The Obama administration, of course, was the point back in 2011 where the so-called pivot to Asia was announced, a redeployment of American global military assets directed at containing and sort of slowing the reemergence of China as a significant force in global affairs. The Trump administration carried that on in its own erratic way, and the Biden administration, if anything, has settled into an even more consistently hostile attitude. We know now that American military trainers have been in Taiwan for more than a year. We know that the United States has been staging provocative passages of American warships through the Taiwan Straits, which are clearly the national waters of China, and that this is all designed to create an atmosphere of fear and anxiety and to sort of prepare the American people, I think, for the eventuality of a possible war with China. There would be no victors, there would be no beneficiaries from that as far as the Chinese people or the American people are concerned. But American politicians are playing a very, very risky game to try to perpetuate American power in an era when it's clearly on the wane, and China is reemerging into a significant role in world affairs. It's just a historical reconfiguration of global power. There's not a lot that the United States is going to be able to do about it, but the elites are kind of freaked out by it, and they're taking these very provocative measures in the hopes that somehow that may slow down or even derail things. But that's simply not going to happen.
You make the point that there would be no beneficiaries from that. That might be an understatement. I heard a Chinese spokesman just the other week saying it's true that the United States is much more powerful than China. It could destroy China completely 10 times over. China is content to be able to destroy the United States only once. It was a chilling reminder that this time the US is picking on somebody almost its own size. This is not some banana republic they're kicking around. It's not a beleaguered, sanctions-stricken country like Iraq or a sanctions-stricken country like Iran. China has the power to entirely destroy the United States. So why would anyone in their right mind risk a war with them?
Well, I don't think that a rational calculation would lead to this kind of provocative activity. I think that the fear on the part of American elites that they're going to lose the global hegemony that they've held for the last 60 or 70 years is making them behave in ways that go beyond really rational calculation. I think that a lot of politicians feel like China bashing is something they can get away with easily. They think it'll win them votes in the upcoming elections. And I don't think that they think very much further than that. I don't think that they actually contemplate the very, very serious consequences that any kind of actual military clash with China would bring. The threat of nuclear devastation is, of course, the horrifying bottom line. But even below that level, a war that took place over the Taiwan Straits would be devastating for the island itself, and it would probably inflict serious damage both on Chinese and American forces in the region. So it's not something that anyone, as you say, in their right mind, anybody playing from a reasonable perspective, would even allow to become a threat or a danger. And yet we see American politicians, for their own very, very short-sighted reasons, ramping up fear, ramping up anxiety, doing provocative things, saying provocative things in a way that's really just completely irresponsible.
Well, I appear every weeknight on RT America, and oftentimes with unhinged, crazed neocons that are openly proselytizing for war with China now, while we can, they seem to be saying. But I wonder if they have calibrated that correctly. The hypersonic weaponry, which China successfully tested just the other week, seems to me to tilt the military balance somewhat. And yet, Doctor, they've managed to persuade other countries to join them on this madcap ocean-tossed escapade. They've got Australia on board. They've got Britain on board. When is it not? They've got Japan on board. And I saw the grotesque spectacle last week of the head of the German Navy, announcing cooperation with the Japanese Navy in the Indo-Pacific, in the South China Sea. The two countries responsible for the greatest cataclysm the world has ever known yet are now our allies in provoking China.
Well, the United States, of course, has grown used to having other countries, especially the ones such as you've named, really consider themselves or have to behave as if they are the vassal states of the United States. American leaders of both parties in the White House, in Congress, have gotten totally accommodated to the idea that we can call on these other countries, even countries with relatively powerful economies of their own, but they are still subordinate to American leadership. They are subordinate to American domination and hegemony, and our leadership here in this country has simply, called in the chips at this point in a number of ways to say, you really need to back us on this. President Biden talks about building a multinational coalition against China. And I think that the vision is that other countries are simply going to continue to line up and bow down to American power. I'm not sure how long realistically that can be carried on. I think that the negative consequences for other countries, and I'm not talking about military conflict, but just the realities of economics and the realities of power relations amongst countries in the world are changing in some very deep and fundamental ways. And American efforts to sort of shore up and perpetuate the power that it has enjoyed for a long time are just not going to work. And I think that it would be better for American politicians to try to figure out a way to make a sort of common cause with China in a pursuit of a future that would be beneficial for the people of both countries. Sadly, we don't seem to see that on the mainstream political agenda.
Lastly, Doctor, and it's a hot potato, this one. The discourse usually is, will America and its vassals take military action against China? But what about if China begins to conclude that actually the build-up of American and vassal military power in their region, in their waters, under their waters, is such that we better ourselves take action to reunify our country while we still can? Reverse the usual discourse, because if I was in China, I'd be working out. I don't think China ever intended to invade Taiwan. They saw Taiwan as an apple that it was waiting to fall from the tree. But what if the US makes it impossible for that to ever happen by making Taiwan a militarized camp against China? Mightn't that provoke China into taking action of its own?
Well, certainly these actions are very provocative. All the things that the United States and its minions have been doing have indeed been very provocative. But we need to bear in mind that just a month ago, on October 9th, Xi Jinping made a very important speech that in which he addressed the question of Taiwan. And he pointed out that it has never been China's policy to aggressively take over the island, but instead that this is an issue that comes down from history between the Chinese people, among the Chinese people, and it needs to be resolved. It should be resolved through the eventual evolution of the situation in a way which will bring people on both sides of the strait closer and closer together. And indeed, that has been the historical trend in terms of travel, in terms of investment, in terms of shared interests. Really, the people on the island and the people on the mainland have more in common, much more in common, much more to lose by division than they would gain, and much more to gain by unity than they would lose. So I think that China remains very determined to pursue peaceful reconciliation between the two sides of the straits. I do agree that the prospect of China being provoked to a point where it feels it needs to take preemptive action, where it needs to push back against American efforts to separate the island, to create a phony independence for Taiwan. I think that's not something that can be entirely ruled out, but I think that that too would be disastrous for people on both sides of the strait. And my hope is, and as President Xi has said, that this is a subject that really needs to be resolved by the Chinese people themselves. It's something that American politicians would do best to just shut up about and stay home.
On a scale of 1 to 10, Doctor, how likely is an armed clash between the United States and China?
Well, that's a difficult question to assess, but I'm afraid I would have to say at this point that it's edging up well above 5 or 6.
It's chilling indeed. Dr. Hammond, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
It's been a pleasure to be here.
On the mother of all talk shows. Have I got a question? Yes, I do. She became the youngest singer to get a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 2003. Who was she? A. Beyonce, B. Britney Spears, she's free, and C. Alicia Keys. Who was it? Answer after the break.
Radio Sputnik.
Downloads of the podcast, huge numbers are downloading this week's highlights in the UK and in the US, but also in countries like Japan, India, Denmark, Saudi Arabia. You probably get executed for that. Korea, Switzerland, the UAE, and Hong Kong in China. Thank you for all the great reviews you've been leaving on Apple Podcasts, and including this one. In British politics, Mr. Galloway stands as the last bastion of sense. Like a fine wine, he gets better with age. I have been a fan of his since 2002. I would recommend anyone to listen to him. The best podcast around. Thank you very much indeed. That was touching testimony. Thank you so much. If you do listen, give a 5-star review. Why don't you?
You are listening to the Mother of All Talk Shows podcast with George Galloway.
They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime.
I like beer. Yeah, we drank beer.
Whoever's in charge, and I want the record.
Let's talk about that. Discussing all the controversies and news across the disunited states of America. Tune in to Fault Lines every weekday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern, only on Radio Sputnik.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Well, believe it or not, the then 21-year-old Britney Spears got a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 2003. Now, I mean, I'm glad she's free and all that. We featured her case a few weeks ago on here. But is she really deserving of a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame? Discuss, if you like. Moats, the podcast, is once again a chart-topping 5-star hit all over the world this week. I mean, I'm going to read that sentence again. Moats, the podcast, is once again a chart-topping 5-star hit all over the world this week. It is astonishing to me, from Australia to Canada to the United States, Latin America, the Middle East, Africa. Our podcast, which is the distilled version of this show, half the length of this show, with all extraneous matter taken, squeezed out, is actually chart-topping and charting in virtually every part of the world. So if you're not already listening to it, please subscribe. It's entirely free, of course, so you can take Moats on the go with you, and do leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts if you're a Spotify user. I have no idea what any of that I've just read actually meant. Spotify? What's Spotify? Please follow us and share with your friends so more people can enjoy Moats. Let's see if we can top the charts in your country. Now, here's the telephone numbers, because it's we're open now for calls. It's 08 081 965522 if you're in the UK. 08 081 965522, entirely free of charge. Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough. People send me these cowardly, insulting things from behind their keyboard. I wish they'd have the guts to pick up their phone and call me. And if you're in the United States, it's also toll-free. It's +1 844 944 3344. That's +1 844 944 3344. Eve in Idaho has done just that, and he's the first caller of the night. Eve, welcome.
Thank you, George, for having me.
Welcome.
I would like to speak about the event of the climate conference.
Oh yes.
Speakers have used the doomsday argument.
Apocalypse now or nearly now, yeah.
To make the case about greenhouse effect. I need to define in 10 seconds what is the greenhouse effect, because it's important to understand. The greenhouse effect is a physical property of carbon dioxide to be transparent for visible light, but opaque for infrared, and as the Earth emits as a black body in the infrared frequency, then this radiation is trapped because the CO2 is opaque to the frequency. Now there is another thing which is opaque, is the nuclear cloud that nuclear weapon can provoke. And it's opaque to infrared, it's opaque to visible light, and it's opaque to life. And this is not just after your guest, you know. I don't know if you have seen on the American, I think, Enterprise Institute rather, they propose to give nuclear weapon to Taiwan. And I borrow what you say, you know, what possibly can go wrong. So I have a request. My request to those climate speakers is that if you want to be more credible, you have to include the eradication of nuclear weapons if you want to make it to 2050. Because what you're saying is that after 2050, it's doomsday. Well, what I'm telling you is that in order to make it to 2050, we need to eradicate nuclear weapons, and that would simplify a lot of problems too, because the defense of country will be less urgent, you know, when. So that's the point I want to make.
Top call. Eve, I couldn't better it, and I won't try. Thanks for making it. James is in Naston, is that? James, welcome.
Welcome, George. It's Naston. Are you okay?
Okay, I beg your pardon. It's been wrongly written up on my board. Go ahead, James.
Hiya. So it's about the gentleman who was on talking about the white poppy.
Yes.
Now, he seems very intelligent and quite well educated.
Very decent young man. I hope I didn't rough him up too much, but I've not got a lot of time for pacifists myself. But go on.
Unfortunately, as I was going to say, he's in the real world. He doesn't make any sense. Because, unfortunately, the way human beings are, war is in us. I mean, we're at the point now, we're in 2020. You know, we've got billionaires, we've got people going up to space, we've got people starving. I mean, when we're analysed in history in a few hundred years' time, it really is going to be embarrassing.
I mean, he couldn't answer, and he didn't like my line of questioning about the Second World War, but it is the best case in point. Because not only was it a necessary war, it was a just war, and it was a noble war. And moreover, it should have been fought much earlier. If it had been fought in 1936 in Spain, the world might have been saved from the Holocaust and the absolutely catastrophic loss of life and limb and public asset and private asset and wealth. The world was set on fire by our failure to militarily confront and defeat Hitler and Mussolini in 1936 in Abyssinia and in Spain.
I mean, you're perfectly correct. All that has to happen for evil to prosper is for good men to do nothing.
Yeah, and that seems to be their policy, really.
And that's it. It's, you know, I mean, morally, I can see where they're coming from, but it's applying it in the real world. It's the practicalities, you know. And unfortunately, it's in us because I mean, I don't think you can say the human beings have evolved to where we're going to end up, because look at the state of the world.
Well, I don't look at it in quite the Manichaean terms that you do, James, but the truth is there's evil in the world, and evil cannot be allowed to triumph. Sometimes it does triumph, and even persist for a very, very long time, but it cannot be allowed to triumph in the world, or nothing that is good in the world will be left to us.
Well, that's right, because I mean, just to be brutal, human beings are animals, and unfortunately, whether you want to look at the society with Donald Trump, whether you want to look at a pack of wild tigers or wild lions, probably a better explanation.
Actually, humans do a lot worse than wild animals. Who generally speaking, only kill because they have to in order to stay alive and feed their families themselves. We do far, far worse things.
But we do, yeah. But you're perfectly correct. We do.
Evil exists in the world. Good exists in the world. Evil exists within us, and good exists within us. Life is a ceaseless struggle between good and evil. That's my worldview anyway. James, thanks for the call, my friend. Richard in Manchester is up next. Go ahead, Rich.
Hello. Thank you very much indeed, George, for having me on the show. I do appreciate it.
Always welcome.
I was absolutely sickened, as I always am, watching the cenotaph. I come from a military family. My father was a coal miner, and 13 kids in the family. And we all voted socialist in those days, and still do to some extent, because there's not much difference between them, I don't think. But watching Blair at the cenotaph today, he looks like a ghost. I'm sure he must have nightmares, like his self-confessed servant, Alistair Campbell, who has to see psychiatrists all the time due to his involvement in all the things he did with Blair and sexing up the dossier to take us into war, which I think was one of the first big wars that they got involved with. But it's going on. And I'm anxious, George, that the people that we are letting in are not being vetted enough. And I'm anxious for my family. I pray for your family who have been threatened by idiots. But these people, maybe it's not the people coming in, but people who are already here and planning of what I'm seeing and listening to on the radio on the other station, to bomb a hospital or to whatever they've been trying to do. It looks as though they've come unstuck. But could you imagine that as another big bombing at the Ariana concert?
A hospital full of new mothers and expectant mothers. It is. We have been extremely lucky. It would appear, as I said, this is not confirmed by the police, that the suicide bomber blew themselves up, either by some malfunction or because of the hour. Presumably, the terror was to be unleashed at precisely 11 a.m. But can you imagine if that suicide bomber, if it was a suicide bomber, had gotten inside that hospital, the front door of which was only yards away, the carnage that would have been created, and the consequences, the political and other consequences that would have flown from that. We have a clear and present threat in our midst, and there doesn't seem a lot of point of allowing reinforcements. Now, the vast majority, I've no doubt, of the people arriving in their thousands on the south coast, who are mainly coming from Muslim countries, the vast majority of them have no such ill intentions. They're economic refugees, like my own grandparents were 100 years ago. But amongst them is the material, and we know this from Germany, we know it from France, we know that some of the people who arrive in this way, this illegal way, and purport to be seeking our protection, are in fact quite soon, or maybe always were, intent on causing terrorist havoc amongst us, murdering us. Now, you know, any government that thinks they can get away with inaction on that front is living in cloud cuckoo land. I believe that's the main reason why Boris Johnson is now behind Keir Starmer in the opinion polls. I'm amazed that it hasn't happened up till now, but now I think after what happened in Liverpool, this argument will reach critical mass. What say you?
I do, and I agree with everything that you just said, George. And there's people going around now, and Blair is one of them, and a few others, who are speaking to the Catholic lobby in America and saying that we must bomb Iran. What on earth have they got to do with anything? That's what I ask myself. And do you think this government could change the laws to enable Afghanistan and Libya and Syria to put all these perpetrators in The Hague on trial for war crimes?
No, the criminals have made it a crime to accuse them of the crimes that they committed. Julian Assange knows all about that. Richard, thanks for that call. It's much appreciated. I've got a question. Let me turn to it, if you'll forgive me. In 2003, Lionel Messi made his debut for Barcelona when he came on in a friendly against Porto. What age was he? A, 15, B, 17, C, 16. Answer after the break.
Radio Sputnik.
Let's take a call. Go ahead, Kenny.
Hi, George. Yeah, I just want to talk about the trans issue that you were speaking about earlier.
Yeah,
I've got
go
a book in front of me by Douglas Murray, and he's got a paragraph here I'd just like to read out, if that's okay.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I was standing on the corner at a quarter.
All right, I'll get him off. He's a nutter. He's a nutter. In the UK, it's 08081 965 522, and in the US it's +1 844 944 3344.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
And the answer was 16. Lionel Messi was 16 in 2003 when he made his debut for Barcelona. Now, I've got so much social media, I won't get through it all, but I promise I will read it all. My eye was caught by Ray Jones, who says George Galloway, perhaps, as the next leader of the Conservative Party. I assume he means that as an insult, but in any case, I'm already spoken for. I'm the leader of the Workers' Party of Britain. Check them out. And Kim Richter says, George, could you please speak to what difference might possibly ensue if either one of these three puppets became leader of any party? That is a very, very good question, but I don't have time, Kim, to do it right now. Claude Me says, George, please stop telling people to make babies. Even if the UK were underpopulated, which it is not, more people burning fossil fuels exacerbates the global problem. Doesn't matter where you are. Well, look, Claude, the Reverend Thomas Malthus, I thought was a century ago discredited, but he has a remarkable number of people who still follow him, whether they have even heard of his name before. The problem in the world is not too many people. The problem in the world is the maldistribution of the wealth that is produced by the population of the world. It's maldistribution and it's waste in weapons and war, and the system of exploitation, sometimes super exploitation, by one of another as a means of making a very small number of people more wealthy. But I've got news for you. Britain badly needs babies. I've done my best. I'm a father of 6. And God bless them all. We need more babies because we have an aging population, and somebody has to work and pay tax to keep us alive and hopefully comfortable in our old ages. If you have a population that is steadily growing older or even falling, as it is in some parts of our country, including my own in Scotland, and on top of a falling population, you have an aging population, you only have 2 choices. You have to have a properly controlled system of immigration, which I favour, and or a considerable boom in the birth rate. Otherwise, there'll be no one to wipe the drool from your mouth when you're in a care home that you can no longer afford because there ain't enough young people working for it. Joanne says it's ominous and strange that Germany and Japan are carrying out military maneuvers in the South China Sea. Indeed, Joanne, imagine how the Chinese feel about that. You know, they say walk a mile in the other fellow's shoes. Imagine how the Chinese feel about the Japanese and German navies sailing warships in the South China Sea. And Marty says, George sounding like Farage at the moment. You see, you are typical, Marty, of the cowards that I referred to earlier. Instead of writing that kind of thing, why not call me? If you're in Britain, 08 081 965522, or are you a gutless coward, a keyboard warrior? If you're not a gutless coward, pick up the phone now, 08 081 965522. Go on, I dare you. And Ben says, enough of this war against terrorism. Terrorists killed 150 people in the last decade. Austerity killed 140,000. Which is more important? Well, Ben, I'm not in second place to you in the long fight against austerity in Parliament and out of it. And whilst your number seems low to me, there would have been an addition to it this morning in the Women's Hospital in Liverpool. If your wife, your sister, your daughter had been in that hospital, you might not be so sanguine, good word, yeah, about terrorism in our midst. And Bushman says the same liberals who advocate intervention in these countries shed crocodile tears when they arrive here. And Paul Hammond says Poland is the darling of NATO. And Mick says the French coastline is almost impossible to police. Is it? Really? This was always going to happen when we left the EU. Well, it was happening before we left the EU. Our border is here now, not in France. I thought we were going to take back our borders when we left the EU. Indeed, you're right, Mick. And that's what I'm demanding from the British government right now, from this seat, from this table, through that microphone. Take back a country which does not control its borders, a state which does not control its frontiers, isn't a state. It's a shambles. And that's what Britain now is, a shambles, with a shambles of a government and a shambles of a Prime Minister and a shambles of an official opposition. Let me take some calls. Simon in Boreham Wood. On you go, Simon. Simon, are you there? I'm not hearing Simon. Let's go to Scott in Glasgow. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, hello, George. Hello, George. Can you hear me?
Yes, the whole world can hear you. Go ahead.
Ah, good. I'm glad the whole world can hear. I want the whole world to hear because the whole world is now being subjected to this. George, like so many on the left, your silence on this issue is deafening. The silence on your issue, the silence on this issue of vaccine passports, on health passports, on jab passports. You have to be jabbed once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. Why are you so silent on the one issue that is affecting the whole planet? The one thing that unites... No, George, you're not letting me finish, please. The one issue that unites everyone on the planet, that is now affecting everyone on the planet, the jab passport, the vaccine passport. Why are you so silent on that, George?
Well, first of all, I'm not remotely silent about it. I have stated... Let me finish now, Scott. It's my show, and you've made a very direct accusation against me, which I'm going to answer. I'm not at all silent on it. I have stated many times, whenever I'm asked, I've been very clear. I'm against vaccine passports. The party I lead has made an official and lengthy and well-argued statement opposing vaccine passports. So I'm not remotely silent about it. But I'm just not that into you. That's your problem, Scott, because I don't believe this is the issue you called it, that affects the whole world. I think war with China, war with Russia is much more important than... No, let me speak. Much more important. Vastly more important. Stratospherically more important than vaccine passports. I think the mass poverty in the land is much more important than vaccine passports. I think the danger of terrorism, the danger of lawlessness, 82-year-old great-great-grandmothers being stabbed in the back in Brentford in London, is all much more important than vaccine passports. So I'm just not into you. I agree with you. I'm against vaccine passports. I just spend my time speaking about more important subjects. Let's go to Simon in Boreham Wood. Go ahead, Simon. Simon? Don't tell me we've lost him again. Maybe a problem with line 1, or maybe he's pulling our leg. Let me read more. Simon, are you there? Are you there?
I'm here now, sorry.
All right, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I was going to bring up the Carl Ritterham case that's going on at the moment. It's going to finish tomorrow. It might be thrown out by the judge.
Tell us about it. I'm not that into that case either.
Okay. Well, basically, he's Joe Biden called. He's 17. Joe Biden called him a white supremacist for what reason I have no idea. Anyway, he was ambushed by a convicted felon who wanted to kill him, and then attacked with a skateboard, and then a gun was pointed in his face. It's so obvious. The prosecution fellow, the absolute dipstick, is incredible. I was wondering, because you've got that, it's being used as a football between the left and the right, and Black Lives Matter. It was on Black Lives Matter protest that sort of a few of us will smack up a few cars.
I know almost nothing about this case, so I'm not going to pretend to. I don't do that.
Right.
But he was running about the street with an automatic rifle.
Oh, that's right. I agree with that. As I say, I think if the prosecution had, gone instead of murder, they would have gone for reckless endangerment. That might have been a better idea. which is fair enough. You know, he's got to learn.
Well, I'll take your word for that, Simon.
Yeah.
Maybe some American callers will enlighten us further.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
On
It's tomorrow. Maybe we can do it the next Sunday.
Yeah, maybe
anyway.
Next Sunday, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Simon.
All right, George, no worries.
Many thanks. Thanks for the call. Who'll be the next leader of the Conservative Party? Rishi Sunak, up again, 58%. Liz Truss, 30%. Michael Gove, 12%. Michael, you'd be as well to drop out of this race. Although on YouTube, you've got rather more support. Sunak, 55%. Truss, 18%. Gove in second place, actually, on 27%. And on Telegram, Sunak, 61%. Truss, 16%. Gove, 32%, almost a third of the vote. Hold that result. Sorry, Michael. I think you might still be in with a shout. Just before the news, Ignacio is in Madrid. Let's hear from him. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, George.
Welcome.
I rang tonight to speak about Julian Assange, but essentially, you were talking earlier on to a couple of guests about peace, war, China, and it's all interrelated.
Yep.
I would first like to invite your audience to remember what it was during lockdown, how many people ended up with mental health, and there was 2 months. Julian Assange was locked up in the Ecuador embassy for 5 years. His crime, he revealed crimes committed by the U.S., war crimes. Under any legislation, he was legally required to report those crimes or else become complicit. So the point is that there is a military-industrial establishment in the West that needs war. The Cold War with the Soviet Union, the Cold War with China, and virtually any other previous Cold War were not for communism or democracy. And in fact, I'm sure you know, the U.S. supported communist regimes which were at odds with the Soviet Union on the basis that, divide and conquer. So there is this establishment that needs to create war in order to keep their jobs and their bank accounts running. So these people have written laws that we are forced to comply with, like report a crime when you've got knowledge of it. Then Julian Assange does that, and look where he is.
Now, the case was heard in the High Court very recently, and we have been promised a verdict before Christmas. Christmas is coming fast. What's your feeling, Ignacio, about how the case went and Julian's prospects of finally achieving freedom as the best Christmas present his partner and children could possibly wish for?
I cannot predict, but I think I can come up with a solution for this. Basically, all of this case is a kangaroo case, and I'm sure you and your audience agree with that. So they are prosecuting Assange for following the law that they have written. Okay, so the only solution out of this mess, which includes Cold War, the prosecution of Julian Assange, war crimes, and as a result of all of that, terrorism here at home, the only way to bring an end to this madness is to take back control of politics.
I'm all in favour of that, Ignacio in Madrid. Thank you very much. After the news, I'm going to Washington, D.C. to speak to Garland Nixon on all things Americano. But first, the news with Elliot King. It's the mother of all talk shows.
Radio Sputnik News.
Counter-terrorism police officers are investigating an explosion in a taxi outside a London hospital which killed one person and injured another. According to eyewitnesses, the taxi burst into flames in front of Liverpool Women's Hospital just seconds before 11 a.m. this morning, when a minute's silence to commemorate the war's dead on Remembrance Sunday was taking place. A police spokeswoman said it has not been declared a terrorist incident, but counter-terrorism detectives were leading the inquiry out of caution. She added it could take some time before they confirm details. The president of COP26, Britain's Alok Sharma, says China and India will have to explain themselves to climate-vulnerable nations as the summit ends. It comes after the two nations pushed for the language on coal to change from phase out to phase down in the deal agreed in Glasgow. However, Sharma insisted the historic deal keeps 1.5 centigrade within reach. It is the first ever climate deal that plans explicitly to reduce coal, the worst fossil fuel for greenhouse gases. The summit, which was initially due to end on Friday, had to go into overtime before a deal was agreed late on Saturday, following the late intervention from India to water down the language on coal. Her Majesty the Queen has missed the Remembrance Sunday service at the Cenotaph in London, as according to Buckingham Palace, she has a sprain in her back. The palace said the 95-year-old monarch was disappointed not to attend the event. The palace previously said it was the Queen's firm intention to attend the service after taking away from her duties for health reasons. She made the decision to miss the event with great regret this morning, a statement has said. Cocaine with a street value of £33 million has been discovered in a lorry load of frozen onion rings bound for the UK. Border Force officials found the 418-kilogram haul at the Channel Tunnel's UK inbound zone in France. A 30-year-old Polish lorry driver has been charged with smuggling Class A drugs. He has appeared at Folkestone Magistrates Court and was remanded in custody until 13th of December. Japan's former Princess Mako has departed for the United States with her new commoner husband Kaim Komuro after leaving the Japanese royal family. There was a minimal pageantry as the college sweethearts, who wed last month, left from Tokyo Airport this morning. They will rent an apartment in New York, where Komuro works as a law firm. Under Japanese law, female imperial family members forfeit their status upon marriage to a commoner. The US military covered up an attack that killed dozens of civilians in Syria. That's according to an investigation by the New York Times. The 2019 attack on the so-called Islamic State fighters killed 80 people, only 16 identified as militants. An independent investigation into the strike was never conducted, according to the New York Times. Officials admitted the bombing for the first time this week, but insisted it had been justified. They say it was unclear if all of those killed, aside from the 16 militants, had been civilians. The FBI has launched an investigation after thousands of fake messages were sent from one of its servers warning of a possible cyber attack. The government agency said the incident on Saturday morning was part of an ongoing situation, but provided no further details. The messages purported to be from the US Department of Homeland Security. They claimed to be a warning about a supposed threat and were titled Urgent Threat Actor in Systems. The emails told recipients that they were the target of a sophisticated chain attack from an extortion group known as the Dark Overlord, according to the non-profit anti-spam watchdog Spamhaus. According to US media reports, more than 100,000 emails were sent out. At least 68 prisoners have been killed in new fighting at the Ecuadorian prison, where more than 100 inmates died in clashes between rivals. The riot at the Liliortal Penitentiary in the city of Guayaquil reportedly began on Friday evening. Police tactical units who entered the prison buildings found guns, explosives and blades. Officials say they have regained control of the jail. And finally, you may think it's barking, but man's best friend no longer has to put up with joining humans on the sofa for soaps or a binge-watch series. Tomorrow, the nation's dogs will have a range of specialist four-legged friendly content to enjoy. Dog TV is a new television network created specifically for lonely or stressed canines, which is set to launch in the UK on Monday. Created after 3 years of research, the channel will air scientifically tested programming aimed to alleviate symptoms of conditions such as separation anxiety, loneliness and stresses, bosses say. It will also have shows to help owners better understand and look after their pets. British animal trainer Victoria Stilwell said, "People think that dog TV is a bit of a weird concept at first, but when I tell them the amount of research that has gone into this, that this TV channel can help their dogs while home alone, improve their lives considerably and help with different stresses and anxieties, they get it." The service will be available on a range of smart TVs, Android and Apple devices, and also online. And that's your Sputnik News. I'm Elliot King.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
So the second poll is out. Who should succeed to the British throne? On the passing of Her Majesty the Queen, of course, and we wish her longer even than she has already lived. We wish her the longest possible life. But on her passing, should it be A, Prince Charles, B, Prince William, or C, should we grow up and have a republic of some sort? It's up to you. You can vote on my Twitter feed, on my YouTube, and on my Telegram channel. Now I'm joined from the Washington, D.C. area with America's finest independent political commentator. That's right, it's Garland Nixon, and he joins me now. Garland, always a pleasure to see you. I've got to ask this first question. Forgive me, I take no pleasure in it. It's not in any sense intended to hurt the people of the United States, but I read a story today that inside the White House, there's a very steadily fast-growing feeling that President Joe Biden is, and I quote, deteriorating fast. If that's true, and I'd like your view on whether it's true, what kind of particular problems does that pose your country at a time when they're on a more or less war footing with both Russia and China?
Well, particularly the problem it poses is that there is behind Joe Biden, there is a bit of a battle going on between several factions, several neocon factions. You know, I've said many times in America, we have a battle between the war hawks and the ultra hawks. And if Joe Biden, sadly, as much of a propensity as Joe Biden has towards militarism, currently he falls into just the war hawks category. So that would be a considerable crisis, because the question would be who would come out ahead in the event that he was no longer able to preside over the empire. Certainly those who are looking at Kamala Harris feel that she's somewhat of a hollow shell, and that she would not be really party to that battle going on between the neocon factions, that she would likely simply follow the dictates of the winner.
Help us with the Constitution. At what point, if Joe Biden doesn't accept that he has to shuffle off the scene, at what point does somebody act, and how do they act? And if Kamala Harris is the number two, if Joe Biden leaves the scene, who then becomes the number two? How is that person chosen?
Well, we've got in America, it starts with the 25th Amendment, which is a constitutional amendment which allows the cabinet of the president, of the sitting president, to, if they come to the conclusion that the president is no longer able to perform his or her duties, they can then go to Congress. You know, there's an administrative procedure through which they can move with Congress to force the person to vacate the seat. At that point, Kamala Harris would, of course, be the president, and she would be allowed to, let me change this. Theoretically, she would be allowed to select the whoever her vice president would be. But in the same way,
authorized by no one, just by fiat, no one would have to validate that?
No, she could in fact choose who her vice president was. But that's why I said theoretically, because in the same way that many people here believe that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, who were both unpopular even in their own parties, were selected by the elite ruling class, many feel that, the discussion for the ruling class is someone like a Pete Buttigieg. And if you think it's a train wreck now, that would be, the bitter end of the party. I mean, he's so connected to the intelligence community that there would be no confidence whatsoever that we had an independent
Tell us more
leadership.
about him. Not many of us on this side of the pond, at least, know anything about him. He did run for the nomination, but he didn't come close in the end. But I do read that he would probably be Kamala Harris's pick for VP.
Yes. Well, a couple of things about him. He was the mayor of a small town in Indiana, a town of about 100,000 people.
Wow.
Well, they consider it a city, but it was, about 100,000 people. He kind of overnight became a star, and he was the kind of star that was pushed by the people in power because he was a top-down star in that the news media, all of the Washington Post, the New York Times, all the powers that be declared him a star, but he didn't have the commensurate support from the electorate. So he's a selected star. He's gay and he's married. He's currently the head of transportation, and he really has been doing a Joe Biden in that he's been missing in action most of the time during some pretty significant crises that are related to his area of expertise.
It ticks a lot of liberal boxes, that team. A black woman president and a gay man as vice president. Is that what that's all about?
Absolutely. It's about creating a Benetton ad, not a competent team of leaders. I mean, clearly that's where the Democratic Party is now. They're about putting the right, making a nice picture and saying, look, we've checked all the boxes. And I think it's intentional because, again, if we get back to the battle going on behind the scenes within various factions of the elite ruling class, I don't think they want much more than a person there who looks the part so that they can enact their policies through them. They want a conduit for power, and that is precisely what Pete Buttigieg and Kamala Harris would be.
I think a phrase is born there, a Benetton ad, rather than a presidency. I'll be surprised if that one doesn't fly. It's what we call a zinger, Garland, and we've come to expect those from you. Okay, so the midterms take place this coming when? In the middle, in May, is it?
The midterms take place, but just about a year. We're right about a year out. It's 2022, the midterm elections, and currently the view is that the Democrats are going to get crushed for any number of reasons. Of course, not the least of which being the lack of confidence in the Biden administration to address economic woes. Of course, his stumbling and bumbling and not appearing to be really having control of the helm. And the circumstances have not worked out well.
Garland, he's not in control of what comes out of either end. If the Prince Charles's wife is to be believed, because he loudly, how shall I say, erupted out of his backside in front of her, which is something she's used to from the horses, but not usually from the President of the United States. So, I mean, I don't know if you saw Peter Sellers' last film, Being There, where Chauncey Gardner, inadvertently stumbles into being the President of the United States. The more I look at Joe Biden, the more like the Peter Sellers character, Chance the Gardener, he looks. So they can't be serious about him leading them into midterm elections, which currently look like a train wreck.
Yeah, well, the problem that our elite ruling class has is that they don't have another alternative. And again, with his health problems, with his issues, with his mental competency, there's a question whether or not he will be able to hold up. He certainly won't be able to go on the stump. He certainly is unable to, to do the things that a president normally would do to support his party leading into a difficult midterm election. They can't. They put Kamala Harris, Barack Obama, et cetera, the usual figures out in Virginia for the Virginia race, and they lost anyway. They have no coattails. So the Democratic Party is in a lot of trouble. And subsequently, since they are the ruling party right now, the United States is in a lot of trouble.
It seems to me, therefore, and I got a whiff of it with the indictment of Bannon, Steve Bannon, Donald Trump's former right-hand man, maybe current right-hand man, who knows? These things go up and down. It seems to me the Democrats' only hope is to criminalize and make impossible a second Donald Trump presidential run. But if they do that, social peace in the country will be very much endangered. That's how it looks to me.
I think you're right. But even then, I think they are so weak. Remember, there's a guy down in Florida named Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis is very popular amongst the Republican base. So the Republicans actually have a few people that are popular enough amongst their base that they can get a good turnout from their base. The Democrats don't have that right now. No one that they would be comfortable with. The people that the Democratic Party would more than likely support, the ruling elite class of the party certainly would not accept. So the Republicans at least still have some faith in the party amongst independents and amongst some of the potential candidates. The Democrats right now, they're in trouble because, as I said, here's their big problem. The people that could be competitive in the Democratic Party are not acceptable to the ruling elite because they're too populist. They wouldn't simply be puppets for the billionaires.
But would Trump allow a surrogate like DeSantis to, as it were, appear in his place?
Well, what I think is more likely, if Donald Trump is healthy, if he's ready to run, you are correct in that the intelligence community and the powers that be would make some attempt to try to stop him. I don't know what that they could do constitutionally. I don't see an option. And again, here's the other option that I would predict: an easy win for the Republicans would be a Trump-DeSantis party. DeSantis is from Florida. Ticket. DeSantis is from Florida, a very important state. He could deliver that state because he's very popular. And of course, Donald Trump being up in years, as is Joe Biden, he would certainly give the appearance that he was ready to take the helm, unlike a Kamala Harris or a Pete Buttigieg.
And how's the liberal media taking all of this? They're stuck, aren't they? They were the choir for Joe Biden, and yet they must gaze upon this current situation with dismay.
Yes, and after Afghanistan, there was a difficult time period because the mainstream media is also, the voice of the empire. So they were very angry that Joe Biden pulled out of Afghanistan. So they attacked him for a while, and now they're trying to recover, regain their feet, and decide how to not so much support Joe Biden as to stop Donald Trump and to stop the Republicans from winning. And I think they've thrown in a towel. I think they understand 2022 is not going to go in their direction. And going into 2022, there are many economists who see the potential for a recession, for bad economic times, which would then, we're looking at, significant majorities in both houses for the Republicans. And might I add, investigations into Hunter Biden and other things that could be even more damaging for the Democrats and Joe Biden.
Good point. I'd forgotten about Hunter Biden and his laptop and his business relations in the Ukraine. Speaking of which, the United States administration made a most peculiar announcement this last few days in which they warned the European powers, the European Union, that Russia was preparing to invade Ukraine. Now, of course, Russia has no intention whatsoever of invading Ukraine. This is a perennial canard which is trotted out. But it had two peculiarities. Why were they warning Europe? Did they imagine that the mighty armies of the Netherlands and Belgium, Italy and Greece are going to fight Russia? Why would they warn the Europeans of this? And secondly, as it will quickly be found to be entirely baseless, are they now so reckless that they'll throw out these kind of baseless accusations, even if time will show that they're entirely false?
Well, in this instance, I don't think that they said that for I'll put it like this. I don't think that this was for the Europeans. I think it was internal. I think it was to get this out into the news, to get this out into the media, so that they could frighten the people of the U.S. and frighten the people of Europe, and that allows them to continue the things they're doing with military buildup, to continue the money laundering with feeding various very expensive weaponry systems into Ukraine. So yeah, I think if you read this as they really meant it, or was it true or false, I think you missed the fact that this is internal, and this is to continue to prime the American public for the absurd activities, and of course the European public for the absurd activities of NATO and the U.S. Towards Russia.
Garland Nixon, as always, fascinating to get your perspective. Thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Is this my last question? No, I'm going to calls. Cornelius is in Swansea. Let's hear from him. Cornelius, welcome.
Welcome. Evening, George. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for calling. Go ahead.
At the start of the show, obviously, you were talking about the trafficking of people coming from France into the UK with illegal migrant issue.
Yeah.
The last 18 months, obviously, we've had a pandemic, and the tourist industry was on its knees, and we've had cruise ships offshore doing nothing. And if some of those cruise ships were used as a processing facility, surely that at least would give a signal to the traffickers there is no guarantee of getting to mainland UK. Because at the moment, they know as soon as they go into the waters, they'd be escorted to the UK. They're onshore. They're being processed onshore. It goes on forever. And yet there's no break in the cycle between leaving France and coming into the UK.
Well, that's exactly right. There will have to be a solution found that does not require these people to take the death-defying journey across the English Channel in a rubber boat. And as soon as they land, they are then sent to 3-star hotels around the country, where the hotels, I can reliably tell you, charge the government £80 a night for these refugees and migrants, refugees. We don't yet know what they are because they haven't been processed. £80 a night,
exactly.
7 days a week, 365 days a year, maybe for many years. It's nice work if you can get it, Cornelius. But it's costing and will cost billions of pounds to the British taxpayer. And you've got the potential, only the potential, that some of them may have ill intentions. And even if they're not terrorist ill intentions, they could be other criminal ill intentions. Local public opinion turns against them. And before you know it, we have a real crisis on our hands. But why is the government not doing anything about this?
Well, everything you said there, George, I 100% agree with you. But at the moment, it looks like the government is not doing anything to try and break the cycle, because as soon as they enter the waters in the channel, they know they're going to be escorted. They know that they can't turn the boats around, which they've been advocating for the past few weeks or so, or a few months. Okay, it's all bluster and theatre at the moment, and it's gone on for such a long time. But what I don't get sometimes, George, to be honest, correct me if I'm wrong, right? In Germany, if, for instance, I moved to Germany and my daughter was born in Germany, I had my family in Germany, and my daughter lived on the wrong side of the law and she went to jail, right? Even though she was born in Germany, German government have got the right to deport her back to your parents' place of birth, which is the UK, even if she had a German passport, because you'd only class as German, true German, if one of your parents were born in Germany. So if Germany can deport these people, even with a German passport, for instance, how is it that we've got such a problem deporting people from the UK?
Well, the first problem is you don't know who they are. You don't know their nationality. They can tell you they came from France. They just lost their passport. There's no way of deporting someone to a stateless person who's claiming to be stateless. There isn't any way of deporting them. That's the problem.
Yeah, George, but we've also got an issue in Parliament where they try to deport people back to Jamaica, and they try to stop people going back to Jamaica, even though they were lived here for X amount of years, and yet Germany can deport people even with a German passport out of their country because one of the parents has to be born in Germany to be classed as true German. Now, I know
we don't have that system. You're right. Children that are born here are automatically British citizens. But passports can be removed from people who weren't born here but were given a passport. I remember very well they introduced that law to deal with just one person. You'll remember him, the Hook. Hamza,
yes,
the Hook. Yeah. They introduced a law to take away his British citizenship. And that law is presumably still on the statute book. But my question's bigger than that, Cornelius. It is this. We keep being told that this is the most right-wing Tory government we've ever had and so on, which is all nonsense, of course. Can only be said by somebody who didn't live through Margaret Thatcher and Norman Tebbit and the rest. But actually, this government is behaving no differently on this question than Ed Miliband would have done. My question is why?
George, honestly, I don't understand why there's such a difficulty of deporting people out of this country. Just because they come across the channel and they've been picked up on boats, why don't the ships that pick up these people on the channel just take them straight back to bloody France?
Well,
if it causes a rumpus, it causes a rumpus.
What if France...
You've got to show some stance, haven't you?
Yeah. I mean, of course, I have sympathy with that view, but what if France refused to allow the British ship with these people on board entry into their waters? You have to pick them up. You can't let them drown. It is a maritime law that if someone falls off a boat, you have to pick them up. And if you pick them up, you have to safely convey them to safety. And if the French didn't allow the British to return them, where would we be then? But your point about how they're... Because, look, some of them might be genuine refugees, which is defined as someone with a specific and well-founded fear of persecution if they're returned to their own country. That's a refugee.
But they come from France, George.
I dealt for almost 30 years in Parliament with many hundreds, maybe thousands of asylum cases. The vast majority of them, I mean 99% of them, did not in fact qualify, maybe 95% of them, did not in fact qualify under the law as political refugees. Most of them were economic migrants. And I don't despise someone because they're an economic migrant. If I was living in Mali, I'd be trying to be an economic migrant too. But we have a responsibility to protect our own borders and our own legal system in dealing with these things. So some means is going to have to be found of processing the applications offshore. Now, that will not solve the problem. You will be able, let's say, 5% of them qualify as genuine refugees. Well, you have to let them in, especially as many of them have come from countries that we made war on. But the 95% are going to have to go back to their own countries if you can identify what their own country is and if their own country will accept them. You see the problem, Cornelius?
Yeah, but at the moment, George, right? I mean, these illegal people that have come across the channel, they can even see on their phones, for God's sake, that as soon as they go into the waters, they're escorted into the UK and happy days. The cycle has to be broken.
Yeah, you end up in a 3-star hotel next to Manchester Airport that I've stayed in many times, and which is now chock full at £80 a night with young single men.
Right, but at the beginning of the programme, when he was talking about our armed forces going to the border in Poland to what's going on with Beirut,
Belarus,
with Belarus, right, and standing to protect their own borders. I 100% agree with all that. But the cycle has to be stopped. And at the moment, the traffickers have got an open checkbook.
Yeah, we should be attempting to pick the people up off the boats and attempting to take them back to France. They can apply for political asylum in Britain from France. Someone who is in France is ipso facto not fleeing persecution in France in almost all cases. France is a safe country. They can apply for political asylum in Britain from France. And that's what we should try and achieve. But what I'm saying to you is, what if the French will not allow them to come back?
If we had an offshore processing facility, at least they know there's no guarantee that they will enter mainland
Well, I'm with
UK.
you on that. I'm with you on that. And the cruise ship might very well be the solution. But that doesn't solve the mystery that neither you or I can answer as to why the government are... Last week, in one day, more than 1,000 people arrived on the beaches. In one day.
George.
That's more refugees than are on the Belarus-Polish frontier.
George, yes, and the reason why, because more and more people know this guarantee that you will be able to get on mainland Britain because they're escorted out of the water.
Yeah.
If you had an offshore facility, at least you've given a message to the traffickers. There's no guarantee, and people are paying the money to the traffickers.
Well, why aren't the French arresting these traffickers? Who's buying these dinghies? Somebody's going into shops or wholesalers and buying rubber dinghies. Why is the French government not requiring you to show due cause for owning one of these big rubber dinghies? Why are the French police, the French Navy, allowing thousands of people a week to illegally leave their country? I think we both know the answer to that. Cornelius,
they're all having a bang.
I've got to move on. It's been great talking to you, because a former legend, Lizzie, I think, in Gloucester, is on the line. Go ahead, Lizzie.
Hi, George. How are you?
We don't hear from you much now. Go ahead.
No, well, I haven't rung up, and since you enabled the ex-Tory voters to bully myself and other women online, and when we objected to that, you blocked us.
I've no idea what you're talking about, but I'm sure it's of little interest to the world. So tell me what it is you want to talk about.
The thing I want to talk to you about is the fact that you stated at the top of the show that it was most likely dinghy refugees that had bombed Liverpool today.
I said nothing of the kind. I said nothing of the kind. Neither you nor I. I said nothing. Stop. I said nothing of the kind. Nothing of the kind. Now, if you want to carry on, carry on. But I said nothing of the kind. You need to listen to it again.
I have listened to it 2 or 3 times because I was so bloody angry at the first one. I thought I'd better listen to that again.
Tell me what I said. Tell me what I said.
That you're after the Tory vote, the ex-Tory vote. I appreciate that.
How dare you? How dare you? Get this woman off the line. I'll tell you what I am desperate about, madam. I'm desperately angry that pregnant women, new mothers in a Liverpool hospital were almost torn to pieces by terrorist explosions. That's what I'm desperate about. I'm not interested in former Tory vote. Why don't you get this foolish paradigm out of your mind? Why don't you start standing up for the women in the hospital in Liverpool, even if it means that you have to question the fact that amongst us, in our country, there are people, significant numbers of people, who are bent upon murdering and maiming us. Your fetish, your infatuation with refugee politics is precisely the reason why you are an utterly marginal group of people and will always remain so. Let me go to camera 4. And in 1978, in Jonestown, Guyana, 917 of a cult were murdered or committed mass suicide. What was the name of the cult? A, People's Temple, B, Branch Davidians, C, Assembly of God. Answer after the break.
Radio Sputnik.
If you're in the United Kingdom, it's 0808196 5522. If you're in the United States, it's +1 844 944 3344. Let me hear from you.
I was just listening to your previous callers about the manufacturing of consent.
Yeah.
People are powerless. They're drowning in a cocktail of confusion, and they just don't know what to do, and they know no one's speaking up for them.
It's bristling out there amongst the white English working class. They feel that Labour hates them, and they hate Labour back.
I think the idea of this capitalism thing that we have limited respect for, which is linked with freedom compared to like a strict socialist, people going on to welfare and not being able to work. And I feel like that almost the world, this great reset and build back better and all these key words that come out with country leaders all over the world, it seems to me to be a little bit worrying.
No, you shouldn't be any more worried than you were before. But you shouldn't be any less worried than you were before either.
If you're a lawyer, which unfortunately, what's his name? Keir Starmer is, he's spending all of his time being right about everything. You know, he can't appeal to every community. It's not good enough. It really isn't good enough. You know, there were 4 other candidates and they were all better than him.
Why has the Labour Party failed so miserably? I mean...
Well, the Labour Party has fallen out of love with the British people, and the British people have reciprocated.
Yeah, but don't you think Labour had some part to play in that, though, with the whole classism thing? I mean, like, you're supposed to be old Labour, right? You went against new Labour, inverted commas. So don't you think it's on people like you to promote actual...
Well,
Labour policies or whatever?
No, why should I... What do I owe the Labour Party, Dan?
Labour Party or whatever.
I think the Labour Party is a catastrophic disaster. It
so
has...
do something about it then. Why are you complaining about it? Why don't you do something about it, right? Instead of complaining.
But Dan obviously doesn't know that I'm actually the leader of a rival political party and stand against the Labour Party in elections.
And George, do you know something else?
You're not going to sing again, are you?
For the last time you spoke to me, you ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. Well, you ain't never caught a rabbit. You ain't no friend of mine.
You've actually got a great voice.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
They were, of course, the People's Temple at Jonestown, Guyana. I'm very sad to say that this is the last time we'll be able to enjoy the company of James Giles, the smartest young man in England. But let's enjoy it while we can. James going on to bigger and better things. I know that the people who watch us and listen to us will hear more of you in the future, but sadly not here on the Mother of All talk shows. So say, if you will, what you think are the big issues of this week in Britain.
Well, the big issues this week, obviously, we've got the Tory sleaze scandal, which started off as Tory sleaze, has then merged into Labour sleaze. Keir Starmer really coming under the spotlight in recent days.
And Charlie Faulkner, Lord Faulkner today.
And Lord Faulkner,
he's another
indeed.
one working in the Virgin Islands. What is it about the Virgin Islands that first attracted all these politicians?
Who knows? Maybe it's the tax haven status the islands have. I couldn't possibly comment. Well, for Keir Starmer, of course, it was Gibraltar. We've got the by-elections ongoing in Britain. There's a number of them now. North Shropshire, Old Bexley. Obviously, Southend's a slightly different kettle of fish. The summary of the COP26 conference. There's really been a huge amount going on this week, in addition to the breaking news, which you've already covered extensively.
Yes. Now, how does all of that impact on these by-elections and on the opinion polls in general? Because, as I said earlier in the show, in defiance of the laws of physics or politics, if not physics, Keir Starmer is currently ahead. How much worse can this get for Boris Johnson? And if it gets worse, what are the Tories going to do about it?
Well, many of the viewers will remember, those in Britain at least, the major government sleaze days. And that really was the dying days of the major government. The Tories never really recovered in the 90s from those sleaze allegations. And there's a real risk that if Boris Johnson doesn't actually pluck up the courage and apologise for his handling of the Owen Paterson affair, if he doesn't pluck up the courage to tell Geoffrey Cox to either give up his work and apologise or go, that actually this could become very damaging for the Tories. The problem Labour have got, though, is that the Tories have a very effective spin machine, and they are now turning the spotlight onto Labour, onto Keir Starmer, onto Lord Faulkner, because Keir Starmer, of course, has raked in over £100,000 since becoming an MP.
Well, he would have raked in a lot more if Jeremy Corbyn had not refused him permission to take a bumper legal job with Mishcon de Rea.
Well, quite. And that would have been even worse for Labour had Corbyn not have blocked it. The odd thing is, though, about that, you've got Starmer's team saying Corbyn had nothing to do with that decision whatsoever. Yet Corbyn has proof that it was him and his team that blocked the move to do that.
Yes, I was surprised that a Queen's Counsel, like, and a Privy Councillor, like Keir Starmer, would, well, there's no other way of putting it, would tell a lie. I thought officers of the court were not allowed to do that.
Well, it's a very peculiar situation we find ourselves in. You often use the phrase two cheeks of the same arse, and dare say that in this occasion you've got two cheeks of the same arse. You've got find the Tories really under the spotlight, and unusually the Tory sympathetic press turning on Boris Johnson over these allegations. But Labour will too come under the spotlight. Now, whether that means that there could be upsets in places like Old Bexley in North Shropshire, we'll have to wait and see. The Liberal Democrats are bussing practically every activist that has a pulse to North Shropshire. They're out in every village every day, canvassing, running a really strong campaign there. They'll almost certainly finish second, but we could just find that it's Chesham and Amersham Mark II, this time not over planning, but over allegations of sleaze.
Whereas the challenge in Bexley and Sidcup is, as it were, from the Tories' right, from the Reform Party and its leader, Richard Tice.
Well, let's be quite clear. Richard Tice won't win the Old Bexley and Sidcup by-election. I'll quite happily eat your hat or a replica of your hat if Richard Tice were to win that by-election. That's how unlikely it is. But what we could see is the Tory vote splinter and let in Labour, unlikely to be the Liberal Democrats, but probably Labour down the middle there if the Tory vote is sufficiently split. Richard Tice is probably one of the only party leaders, maybe the Greens too, that can stand up and say, we are relatively clean in this mess. Even the Liberal Democrats in North Shropshire, Ed Davey, the Liberal Democrat leader, was on the radio earlier this week justifying his £85,000 worth of consultancy a year. His justification is that he has a severely disabled child that requires around-the-clock care, and so his £85,000 a year consultancy goes to his son's care. All very well and good, but let us not forget that when Ed Davey was in the coalition government, he repeatedly and continuously voted to cut benefits for disabled people, to introduce universal credit, and set the NHS on its privatisation path that we're down now.
Rather good point. I've said how will it affect the by-elections, but how does it affecting the ranks of the Conservative Party? They are an absolutely ruthless party. I was there when matricide occurred, when they politically assassinated their queen, Margaret Thatcher. I well recall her hurrying through the corridors, tears in her eyes, as her former acolytes basically dumped her to save their own skin. If they could do that to Margaret Thatcher, they would certainly not hesitate to do it to Boris Johnson, would they?
No, certainly not. And you've seen Rishi Sunak earlier this week on the airwaves, on the radio, almost rebuking Boris Johnson over this, him expressing personal sorrow over the Owen Paterson vote. And that's very unusual. That's the most out of line a Tory minister's been prepared to be. Now, Rishi Sunak obviously knows among the grassroots in the Tory party, he is the favoured choice at the moment.
He won our poll out the park, really.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, he's facing a growing challenge among the Tory grassroots from Liz Truss. Boris Johnson, former Foreign Secretary, now Prime Minister. Theresa May, former Home Secretary, was obviously Prime Minister before Boris Johnson. So Liz Truss is in one of those great offices of state. She's really building her base among the Tory grassroots. But those two are on manoeuvres. I think they see the writing could be on the wall for Boris, particularly if Labour grow their poll lead. It's only just 1-2 points, well within the margin of error at the moment. But if that continues to grow and Labour emerge from this relatively unscathed, then the Tories may well look to replace Boris Johnson.
And what form would that take? Men in grey suits or a motion of no confidence?
Well, I mean, there are many that argue that Boris Johnson actually doesn't really enjoy being Prime Minister anyway. Dominic Cummings, on his recent online blog, claimed that Boris Johnson asked him at the height of the COVID pandemic whether or not it would look acceptable for him to focus on writing his book about Shakespeare rather than actually dealing with the day-to-day governance of the country. He compared it to waking up daily and pulling a 747 down the runway by hand. So if that's to be believed, and take it with a pinch of salt, Dominic Cummings is a rather bitter gentleman.
He does have motive, yes.
Well, indeed. He uses his blog to just launch broadsides at the government. But Boris Johnson, it's clear, you know, his heart isn't in it. He could earn a lot more not being Prime Minister. He's got a large number of children. The exact number we still don't know. He claimed recently in America, when he was in America, that it was 6 children, but whether that is the true number, we shall probably never know. But he's got, let's say, a fair amount of child support to be paying. He's been on the record as saying that his £150,000 PM salary isn't enough. So, you know, you may find that if a group of men in grey suits actually went to Boris and said, look, mate, you've done us well, you've got Brexit done, but, you know, do you maybe want to take a back seat now? I wouldn't be surprised.
Now, just before you go, who should succeed to the British throne? Prince Charles, 27%. That's up 2. Prince William, 39%, so well ahead of his father. But the Republic on 34%. Although on YouTube, it's 16% for Charles, 24% for William, 60% for a Republic. And on Telegram, it's 6% for Charles, 32% for William, and 62% for a Republic. How much of a crisis for the monarchy is it in Britain that rather a lot of people including Peter Hitchens, a former monarchist, are now saying, we love the Queen, but we can't wear Prince Charles.
Well, there are a large number of people who remember Charles's behaviour towards Diana. She was, of course, the people's princess, and people held her very dearly. Many still have very fond memories of her. So there is a dislike of Camilla, perhaps even more so than Charles. I think if the public pressure was there, then the royal family may have to think twice about the future beyond the Queen. Obviously, wish Her Majesty the best of health. It's unfortunate she wasn't able to get to the cenotaph today for that remembrance service. The royal family bring in a fair amount of tourist trade, etc., or at least that's the argument for a monarchy. The Queen is held in high regard, but after that, my personal preference would certainly be William. I think Charles isn't seen by the British public as someone with quite the standing that the Queen has, or indeed William and Kate.
Well, it's been marvellous, as I always say, having you. The very best of luck in the next stage of your career. And as I say, I'm sure we'll be hearing more from you. Let's take Derek in Plymouth. Go ahead, Derek.
Hello, George.
Hi.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Welcome.
I have to say I'm very nervous. I'm quite a reticent person at the best of times.
OK, just take your time. I promise not to eat you.
It's concerning your chat with the chat about the white poppies.
Yeah.
And what you were saying about the need for us to stand up against the Nazis.
Take your hand away from the mic on the phone, please.
Yeah,
that's it. That's better. Yeah, go ahead, Derek.
Yeah. Did you hear what I was saying?
Yeah.
Well, I do agree that it came to such a stage that we did have to fight the Nazis. But I feel part of what the white poppy thing is saying, we need to look at not just the military side of remembrance, but the totality of the suffering that war causes and the reasons and the build-up to war and the possibilities of avoiding that, and lessons could have been learned from the past. I've just been watching quite recent YouTube talks by a man called, I don't know if you've heard of him, an economic historian called Michael Hudson, who's just released an update of his book called Super Imperialism, that describes how in the First World War, the Americans joined our side because they wanted to guarantee that the huge debts that we owed America were paid back.
Well, not only have I heard of him, he was a guest on this show not 2 weeks ago. I commend that interview to you. Sorry, Derek, it's not a great line and the hour is late, but don't be shy. Call back anytime. Tom is in Saskatchewan in Canada. Let's hear from him. Tom, go ahead.
G'day, George. How you going today?
All good, by the grace of God. Thank you.
Yeah, good. I watched your. This is my first call, and I've watched your commentaries on RT, and it's very, very interesting. Very interesting talks that you give, and it's pretty straight up.
Thank you.
What people need to hear.
Thank you.
Here in Canada, our national news systems, we can't get this straight as well as in the United States and in England too, I'm sure. But I got a question for you, and I'll just ask you the question and just leave it with you, George.
Okay.
Excuse me. With all the things that have been going on for the last 40 years, I've listened to Max Blumenthal, Kim Iverson, Cyrus Jensen, John Pilger, Jimmy Dore, and yourself. And you can't get anything straight from national news medias here in Canada or USA on China or Julian Assange. Julian Assange doesn't even make the radar here. So what would be the chances of Max Blumenthal, Kim Iverson, Cyrus Jensen, John Pilger, Jimmy Dore, and yourself actually addressing the United Nations someday to give the people of the world and United Nations a factual lesson on what's been going on for the last 20 to 30 to 40 years.
Well, look, Tom, I'll pause only to pick up my toothbrush and I'd be on my way to New York. But I very much doubt whether the powers that be in the United Nations would hear us. But it's an interesting thought, and we'll certainly explore it. I've got to clear the lines because there's a legend, Norma in Bristol, on the line. Go ahead, Norma.
Hello, George.
Hi.
Hi. I did have 3 points, but I don't know if I've got time.
Yeah, you do. You do. Go ahead. You've got 5 minutes, nearly 4 minutes.
Okay. First of all, the comment was, you know Guy Burgess, when he was gay,
Yeah.
how did he get on in Russia? Because I understood homosexuality is illegal there. Or
No,
was it
it's not remotely illegal. In fact, there's a gay bar.
Yeah, but when he was there,
it might have been illegal then, yeah. I don't know precisely, but being illegal doesn't mean there aren't any gay people. So
No.
as far as I know, Guy Burgess did not go short, if you know what I mean.
when he got on with it. Okay. The other thing is Geoff Tibbs with the Peace Pledge Union.
Yes.
I agree with a lot of he said, but I still think it's a pity that he didn't answer your question about World War II and fascism. But Sarah Sultana, the MP for Coventry, today she laid a wreath in memory of all those who lost their lives in the war for a more peaceful world, and the wreath had red and white poppies in it, which I thought was very nice.
You think that's a useful compromise, really?
Well, I do really, because yes, I do.
I see that Keir Starmer's trying to, or Keir Starmer's supporters, to be more accurate, are trying to get rid of Zara Sultana. What do you think of that?
Oh, I like her. I think she's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And she's gone through an awful lot of trauma and some very nasty things have happened to her. And I'm a great supporter of her. But let me say, George, James, I have enjoyed your contributions. I think you've, I really loved it. And I wish you very well for the future in what you do.
That's very kind of you. Thank you very much indeed, Norm. Always a pleasure to hear from you on a Sunday evening.
Yeah, well, I don't know about that, but I mean, I like...
No, it is. The whole audience waits for a call from you, Norma. We feel something might be wrong if we don't hear from you. How is your health, your husband's health?
Oh, he's not very well, really. But we're not doing too badly. I actually... my cop-out, like I've told you before, is my little nest, because... up here, I can do my accounts on the computer, look at the different things. And today, I've got 400, which to me, as followers, is quite good, because I got my 400.
400 on Twitter?
Yes.
Fagash flow. Fagash flow. We got to make that 400, 4,000 before we're finished. Norma, thanks very much for that call. James, people are going to miss you. You've been very popular. I know that you cannot, because of the terms of your new position, come back on the radio. What will you miss most?
I'll miss, I think, discussing the current affairs of the week with your good self. You're a fountain of knowledge on pretty much everything, actually. And that's reflected in the audience numbers and the number of people that ring in every week. And so, although I won't be in front of the camera, it's not a true farewell. I'll still be behind the scenes, of course, supporting as I can. But it's been a real pleasure. So thank you very much indeed for having me.
The pleasure was ours, and we all gained a great deal from your presence here. So, Prince Charles, I'm afraid your bottom is out the window. There's almost no support. There's just over a quarter want you to succeed the Queen. Prince William is ahead, but he's only about 4% ahead of a republic. I think this issue, when Prince Charles becomes king, as he must immediately, will quickly move into being a sharp and important political controversy. The demand for a referendum on changing our system will quickly grow. And if the royals had any sense, then Charles would abdicate pretty damn quick and put William in his place. It's been marvellous for me. If it was for you, come back next week. Bertie Auld, rest in peace.